Master, how are you?
I'm very well, yes. Just freshly back from London yesterday and Oxford the day before that. So I've had an exciting weekend.
Wonderful. Seen some countryside and some greenery, I hope, in the process.
Well, yes, but rather swiftly floating by, because I'd come down to preach at Magdalen College, Oxford, and then I came to stationers, of course, for meetings. But it's been very good, very stimulating weekend.
Excellent. Very glad to hear it. Now, the purpose of this conversation was that the young stationers thought there are so many opportunities they would have met you in person over the last year whilst you've been in post, and that up to now, we haven't been able to have those little aside moments to ask you a few questions and some anecdotes and learn more about you individual, but also how you're finding a role in the company. So I put it to them after our conversation a few weeks ago, when you so kindly said that you felt a little awkward asking me the questions, that actually we should ask you some questions ourselves. So I've asked them to come to me with some questions. And the first one comes from Octavia, which was, what made you want to become the master of the Stationers' Company?
Well, it's not quite like that, really, because it's not what makes you want to become it, because it's sort of, I didn't plan it, and there's no way I think you could plan it. And my guess is if you did try and plan it, it would never happen. It's simply that I became a stationer really because I've been at their school, and the school sadly closed some years ago now, and a number of people, including Sir Clive Martin, Lord Mayor at one point, my wife, and various others said, why don't you become a stationer? And that will be a way of keeping a link with the school. And then after that, someone asked me to be a renter warden. And sort of halfway through that year, the clerk, William, said, well, would you be interested in becoming part of the court, a court assistant? To which I said yes. And once you're a court assistant, there's a possibility that you might then become master.
There we go. How interesting. And what interesting to hear there's no sort of great plan for these things. I think a lot of members maybe think there's a master plan as to how one becomes the master, but it does seem that many people have that journey that evolves, and they become more and more involved with the company. So you also wanted to know what you think the future of the Stationers' Company looks like, which is an intriguing question.
I think it looks very positive for a variety of reasons. I think stationers have been really good at adapting to the changes in publishing, in printing, packaging, all across the board in our industries. And that isn't just recently, that goes back to the late 15th century when printing arrived. We really got into that quite early. And then the whole copyright process back at the beginning of the 18th century, and then the development of a near monopoly really, that people had to come through stations. But in this past generation, we have moved ahead remarkably with the whole digital world, without ever forsaking the world which we've always been part of. And on top of that, on Monday, I walked around the sites where we are doing the new work for the hall. And that's so exciting too, because it's going to make the hall so much more adaptable. It means that anyone, even if they're in a wheelchair, can get anywhere in the building. But also, it'll look more attractive. It'll look 21st century, and we can use it, perhaps 3 or 4 different things can be going on in one day. It's just marvelous. And of course, in the process, we're seeing some very interesting things being dug up from the past.
Yes, the archaeological findings are fascinating. I have no doubt there'll be all kinds of things written about them for us to digest over the coming years. So Tavian would like to know what book you're currently reading, which is a very apt question, as you've got so many books behind you, I can see on your bookshelf.
Well, I'm reading 2 books. I'm always reading 2 books because I've taught theology for many years, and therefore I always try and keep up with that. And I do a great deal of reviewing. I think I've reviewed about 250 books in my lifetime so far. So this time I'm reading Brighton Rock by Graham Greene. I'm quite a Graham Greene fan, but I haven't read one for a while. So yeah, that's what I'm reading. And before that, I just finished reading a biography of Lord Grey of Falodon, who was the Foreign Secretary when the First World War began. And the other one I'm reading alongside that is a diary of a man called Alan Donn, who later on became Dean of Westminster. But while he's writing at the moment, the thing I'm reading is when he was the chaplain to Cosmo Gordon Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury. So you hear about all this, and I'm looking forward to the part when we come to the abdication of Edward VIII, because the Archbishop had a part in all that. So it's very interesting. So that's the sort of theology book I'm reading at the moment for fun, really.
Excellent. That leads me to a few obviously very relevant questions about the clergy. So the first most obvious question is, what made you want to go into the clergy in the first place?
Yeah, that is a good question. And it goes back a long way, really. The one thing that's really fascinating is that my family weren't churchgoers. And I'll never forget a friend of my mother's, who she'd known since she was a young girl, said to my mother, when it turned out that I was offering for ordination, she said, "I remember when Stephen was a little boy of 4 or 5, I knew he'd be ordained." Now, that's an extraordinary thing, isn't it? You know, she was a churchgoer. She was a churchgoer. So that, I think that's fascinating. And well, what happened was I came back to an active Christian faith in my late teens, not in any dramatic way. I went up to evensong at the local church and met people. I worshipped regularly, and I began to think, actually, I wonder whether I'm being called to do something rather different. I've been interested in politics, so I thought, well, you know, the world could be a better place. Is politics the way towards that? And I think in the end, I came to the conclusion that the church offering for ministry might be really quite a positive way of actually seeing how the world could be better, because that's after all at the heart of what the Christian faith's about.
How fascinating, and how amazing that insight that was so obvious from when you were so young to those around you, that that's what you were destined for. Lewis, who is the chair of the Young Stationists, who we all know very well, he would like to know about the relationship between the church and the stationers. He'd like to know how it's changed or evolved over the years, and what your opinions are on that.
Well, I think we've always had good relationships with the church stationers, but at the same time, there's been a sort of mixed economy. So, I mean, not everyone will be members of the Church of England, not everyone will be Christian believers. Some people won't have belief. So I think we've always tried to hold the thing fairly gently together, as it were. But of course, there are 2 or 3 events, certainly 2 events in the year when clearly the church and the company come together. There's the bubble service, which is coming up quite soon. And of course, that's quite interesting, because the person who actually set the thing up, Richard Johnson, gave us this extraordinary text on which the person has to preach. Life is a bubble. And there have been some remarkable addresses given. And then, of course, there's also the Ash Wednesday service, which happens normally in the crypt of St. Paul's, in St. Faith's Chapel, which was set up in the very early 17th century. So there are good continuing links. And also, of course, we have a chaplain who is tends always to be the vicar of St. Bride's. St. Bride's is our church. And we've recently had this rather good link with St. Martin within Ludgate, because by actually opening a doorway into St. Martin's, it's turned the garden into a cloister. So there you are, you see. So that's just a little answer to Lewis's question, but I'm sure it's rather inadequate.
Not at all. Fascinating, and rather remarkable again how it comes full circle, actually, these things. I love the way the universe works like that. touching on your time in the House of Lords, to move to a different part of life, Matthew is fascinated to ask about the House of Lords and how it works and your experience of it. His question was, you were admitted to sit as one of the Lords Spiritual in 2009. And what is your sense of the work that the House of Lords does? And what are the highlights of your time in the House, please?
Well, first of all, I can say that I enjoyed my relatively brief period, 6 years or so in the House of Lords. I can assure you that there were some things I've done as a clergyman which we had to do, which I've not enjoyed as much as others, but I did enjoy the House of Lords, although it was quite terrifying on occasion, because you had an extraordinary array of people, some very experienced politicians, because quite a few MPs end up being made peers, and also people at the top of their profession across the whole spectrum, people like lawyers. The Astronomer Royal was a member of the House of Lords, and then artists, broadcasters, everything you could imagine. So when you stood up to speak, you knew that you were putting yourself, in a vulnerable position. But I liked it very much. And one of the two things I'd say about the House of Lords in comparison to the Commons is, first of all, it's much more civilized. So there's not lots of sort of rhubarbing going on and people sort of shouting and so on.
I'm glad to hear.
Yes. And secondly, there are no standing orders in the same way as there are in the House of Commons. So it's just really learning a tradition. You know that you wouldn't normally, you wouldn't interrupt anyone, but if someone's speaking and you want to interject, you stand up, and the speaker then sits down automatically, listens for the question, and then continues. So there's that. And the third thing I think I'd say, I said two, but there's a third thing, and that is that there are lots of very good friendships across the House. And so I think you get a more intelligent approach, because people are prepared to listen to each other, because they'll often find they have more in common than what divides them. And of course, that means that there's reasoned debate. And I think it means that the legislation that ultimately comes out of Parliament will be better than it would have been, much better, if it hadn't been through the House of Lords.
Fascinating. Again, thank you very much. I feel I need to go and read up an awful lot more about the House of Lords works now. Now, I would like to ask you how your life has been enhanced by being a stationer, because you have been a stationer for a long time and you have done many things in your career during that time. But how do you think the company has enhanced your own personal life?
Well, I think in so many different ways. I think, first of all, any profession, and it'll be the same with you as a journalist, it'll be in the medical profession as lawyers and so on. Any profession, if you're not careful, you can get trapped within your own world. And, you live, breathe, and, all the rest of it, the church. And it's really good to have other things going on all the time that remind you that the world is a bit bigger than the church, So that's been one part of it. The second thing is, because I was at the school, and because I was also for a chunk of time, quite a long while actually, a director and then chairman of a publishing company, it was a very useful way into a wider network of people also involved in those things. Of course, I can remember the hall right the way back to when I was just a little boy, singing in the choir at St. Paul's at the John Norton service. And then another thing, of course, is the friendships that you develop. I now feel I have a huge range of friendships. And in an odd way, that's even been increased in this very peculiar year through which we've come. But there are so many different people from so many walks of life living all over Britain, but not just Britain. People across in Germany we've been speaking to, in Geneva, in New York, in the Netherlands. So it's about people. A lot of it's about people, really, in so many different ways. as well as being about the industries in which we're involved.
I think you're so completely right about so easy to be caught in one's own bubble of one's life and career. So those friendships I've certainly found in my very small amount of time in the company already, I have forged so many fantastic friendships and very different like-minded people from so many different walks of life and so many different careers, and it's a really rich tapestry of individuals. Ella Khan, the former chair of the Young Stationers, has two, I think, quite tricky questions for you, but they're really interesting. She would like to know, it's my final two questions to you. What is a moment in your career that you're most proud of? And also, what is a moment in your time as master that you are most proud of?
They are interesting questions, aren't they? The first one, I have been very, very fortunate. And so it's very hard to pin down any one particular moment that I've been particularly proud of. I think if someone said to me which of the sort of procession of jobs that I've done did I enjoy most, I'd find it quite hard to answer, because I was the Archbishop of Canterbury's Foreign Secretary for 6 years, going all over the world, meeting people, you know, eminent people and famous people who I'd never imagined I'd have met. And that was fascinating. But then when I was made Dean of Norwich, Norwich is one of the great cathedrals of England. And I just remember the moment, the service when you're put in, as it were, and installed, as they say, it sounds like being plugged in. You walk all the way through the cathedral, right the way, it's a very long building, and eventually end up at the Bishop's Throne, which is the far east end. And that was an amazingly sort of inspiring moment, really. But then there are other occasions when I think one of the things where I nearly had to go and sit down because I couldn't quite believe it was when the Vice Chancellor of the University of East Anglia telephoned me and said, "We'd like to give you an honorary doctorate." And I thought, golly, I was really moved by it. I had the same thing happen in Huddersfield later, but it was a really moving moment that he talked a little bit about what the degree would be and why they decided and so on. And then of course, eventually you go and receive it, and there's an oration and you make a little speech yourself. So they're just a scattering of things, but I could give so many more because I've been very, very, very lucky, I think, very lucky in stimulating things. And then in terms of stationers, what would I say there? I suppose in the end, what could I say, but that it was an enormous honour to have been elected as the, well, first of all, as the under warden, because you're not elected as master straight away. But when you're under warden, you know that, well, in 2 years' time, something even more daunting could be coming your way. So that was, you know, I think probably that moment when you're made under warden. And then, of course, when you become master. But actually, they're just two tiny moments in a really fascinating time that I've had. And I'm grateful to so many people in the time that I've been a stationer, been on the court and so on.
Thank you so much for navigating those, as I said, tricky questions. There's so many things that I thought you may well have touched upon. So thank you for enlightening us on those. Ella always asks a very interesting question, so I did wonder how you'd respond. Thank you very much for your time this morning. I feel like I know so much more about you, which is particularly marvellous. I've really been able to see you face to face. The very best of luck and love from all of us, I think, for the next few weeks while you remain in post. And we very much look forward, all of us, to seeing you in person as soon as it's safe to do so. So stay safe and well, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily, very much indeed. I missed out lots of things that might have been kept in there, including time working for Shell Petroleum and all the rest of it, but that can be for another time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.